Now we will direct you to Nir, who is situated at a current protest against Joe Biden. Thanks, El. Notice how in public this crowd is much smaller than the one that you saw in the 2016 protest. They are not anonymous, and silent Trump supporters can be identified in this protest, which is probably why this protest does not even come close to the comparison with the 2016 protests in terms of protest support. No matter who wins, protests are still going to occur, but with conflict theory as part of functionalism, they occur on a much larger scale when protests are opposing Trump. Next, for the overall narrative of both the process and the aftermath of the elections combined, race, gender roles, and nationalism are all pertinent concepts when interpreting the impacts regarding the election. On to you, Faison.
Thanks, Nir. Now, how does race play into the elections? Race has been a leading element of the US elections throughout history and undoubtedly has played a role in the 2020 election. Likewise, the outcome of the election definitely plays an important role in reducing racial intolerance for the future of America when we observe these current information and affairs. Unlike in Australia and multiple other democracies, voting in the US is voluntary. However, the racial structure in the US contains aspects that suppress some voters while motivating other voters. The variety of people who were suppressed, as well as motivated by racial prejudice, played a significant role in the outcome of today's US presidential election. However, with polarization and tribal epistemology, it proved difficult to convert likely voters away from their political allegiances. As a consequence, throughout history, candidates have tried to suppress voters while appealing to others using racial intolerance as reinforcement. For example, Donald Trump's campaign strategists intended for Trump to noticeably characterize strength so he could appeal to white women, as their support in multiple states like Minnesota and Wisconsin has been losing in electoral points. Trump also firmly expressed to the Proud Boys, who are a white supremacist group, that he wanted their support in his first debate. These are prime examples of how a candidate for the 2020 election has attempted to use race to appeal to a certain demographic. However, race can also be used to suppress voters. Democratic supporters and theorists claim the high turnout in the elections all are proof that all voices are heard, but in reality, this is unfortunately not the case, as efforts are constantly being made to manipulate and suppress the electoral participation of racial groups, especially black voters. To get a better understanding, we have to look at America's electoral system and its history from an anthropological perspective. Following the American Civil War, which transpired during the 1860s, freed African Americans who were previously enslaved and unable to vote as a result seized the right to vote instantaneously. They attempted to do this by sending representatives to southern states in Congress, but in the early 1870s, white Americans generated systematic regulations to suppress black voters. Some examples of these regulations include property clauses, educational clauses, and even the well-known grandfather clause. This grandfather clause was a clause giving Congress authority to restrict men from voting if their grandfather was not eligible to vote before 1867, which was obviously the case for almost every black person at the time. These regulations were carried out for a long time, but it eventually came time for electoral candidates, like Trump in this case, to unfortunately develop new forms of suppression. These systematic methods also included approaches to suppress other races, especially ones with high population of undocumented U.S. immigrants, such as Hispanics, South Americans, and Central Americans, who make up for 96% of undocumented U.S. immigrants. Throughout the course of the last 10 years, 25 states have introduced methods in the form of laws and regulations to make it burdensome, problematic, and difficult for both African American and Hispanic people to vote. Terms of these laws include requiring voter registration, requiring photo ID, banning previously convicted felons who have served their respective sentences or paid their respective fines, deeming people with outstanding court fees ineligible for voting. These measures have advertently robbed more than 6 million adults of their right to vote, of which African American and Latino groups have been the majority of those. Due to positive changes in racial structure after many years of fighting, there are countless African Americans who still can vote, and in this election have much reason to do so. These reasons include the BLM or Black Lives Matter movement, as well as inspiration to encourage African Americans to vote for Joe Biden rather than suppressing their votes. Voting for the Democratic Party would enlarge the possibility of electing the first female African American Vice President Kamala Harris, and Joe Biden's previous 8 years of vice presidency with Obama also provides motive for African Americans to vote for him. All in all, the Biden-Harris victory provides an opportunity to prevent further disintegration of race in Democratic participation and allow for representation of African American women in federal politics.